Hello, I'm Tom Gosling, Professor in Practice in a Financial Markets Group at the London School of Economics, and I'm an Executive Fellow at the European Corporate Governance Institute. And I'm really pleased to be here with Laura Hillis today, Director, Climate and Environment, Responsible Investment at the Church of England's Pensions Board. And we're going to discuss the series that Harald Walkate and I wrote for ECGI on the topic, Does Sustainable Investing Work? And so, Laura, thanks very much for joining me today. To start, perhaps you could explain what the Church of England Pensions Board does and your role within that.
Sure. So the Church of England Pensions Board is a pension fund, and we look after the retirement savings for the 42,000 beneficiaries of the pension fund, who are people who either work for or have worked for the Church of England. So that would include people who are in clergy roles, but also people who've worked for kind of the Church of England's head office in different administrative functions. My role within that is I am part of the investments team. So what we look at is basically how we allocate the investment strategy and deliver the investment strategy. And specifically what I look after is our climate change and environment approach. So I'm looking at the really complex and challenging issue of climate change and biodiversity loss and how we address that as a pension fund. And really what that means on a day-to-day basis is I'm looking at things like our specific action plans, how we incorporate that into how we appoint asset managers, how we set strategies, deliver our investments, but also I do a lot of our stewardship with portfolio companies as well.
Okay, fantastic. And we'll come back to how you think about responsible investment issues a little bit later on. But I'd like to start with your reaction to the series of articles that we put together for the European Corporate Governance Institute. And we'll put a link to these in the show notes. But we try to analyse the academic evidence on the real world impact of sustainable investing. And we use this analogy of the three stages of a rocket needed to put a satellite successfully into orbit, which is at first, the sustainable investing activity needs to have some effect on companies. Second, companies need to respond to that and change what they do. And third, those changes have to persist rather than being offset by the actions of competitors or other actors in the system. And what we found was that when we reviewed the academic evidence, we found that conventional sustainable investing techniques struggle to make it through all three phases, which led us to the conclusion that investors wanting to have impact perhaps need to focus less on achieving sustainability outcomes directly and a little bit more on influencing the circumstances in which good outcomes can occur. And while this can include kind of realistic engagement objectives, it also includes things like policy influence and, of course, work on genuine impact investments and things like blended finance. So I'd like to start with your reactions to our work and maybe being positive to begin with. What did we get right in your view?
Yeah, so thank you. And I really enjoyed reading it. So thanks for putting the time into this piece of work. So first of all, I completely agree with the point that you make early on that sort of ESG investing is just investing. And when we're talking about this bigger piece of work around real economy impact, it's actually a very different thing. So secondly, I agree with some parts of your overall question. In particular, I think the question about how investors can best achieve real economy impact is a good question. And particularly, I like that you try and focus on effectively, from a practitioner perspective, how we can have the most impact. And by that, I mean really how we can best allocate quite scarce resources to achieving really meaningful outcomes. I think that's a really valid and important question to be asking. Thirdly, I'd say I really agree with your findings on divestment in particular and kind of the general capital allocation findings. So I think it's pretty well understood now and to be honest, I think you'd find that most practitioners would agree with this as well. I don't think this is a controversial view. I think most of us have come to the conclusion that divestment and other capital allocation choices like overweighting or tilting strategies, particularly in public equity markets, they might achieve a particular outcome from an investment thesis perspective. You know, if you think climate solutions are going to perform more strongly, then it probably makes sense to overweight them. But I don't think you'd have many people arguing that that has a real economy impact, which is quite a different thing.
Yeah.
I also think your point, which was a very well-made point on the difference between public and private markets, and that there's not a lot of data on private markets, but potentially that's where a lot of the real economy impact can happen. I think that was a really good question and a really good point and well made. And then probably lastly, I think there's a bit of I don't know if you made the point explicitly, but I feel like there's a subtext within some of this piece of work, but also I would say your work more generally, because I've read some of your other articles, that sustainable investment in general can only achieve so much in terms of addressing systemic risks. I think that's true. And I think, other actors, particularly policy, And those sorts of shifts are really needed. But I guess what I'm really interested in as a practitioner and a person is the extent to which investors can align their interests and their behaviours and their activities financially, but also on behalf of their beneficiaries to seek better outcomes, particularly on these big systemic risks, and achieve those better long-term financial and social sustainability and stability outcomes. But I guess, yeah, I would agree with the premise that there's only so much sustainable investing can do.
And so what did you think we either got wrong or missed or perhaps just underemphasized?
Well, I have a few.
Yeah.
So I think in general, I struggled a bit with the overall question of, does sustainable investment work? Because, and there was a quote in the piece, most SI practices are intended to trigger a three-stage process, which I interpreted as most SI practices are designed to deliver real economy impact. I'm just not sure that that's true. I actually think what you'd find is that a subset of responsible investment practices are designed to deliver a real economy impact. And the majority of them are trying to achieve something else. Like what I said before about the climate solutions piece, I think if you also look at where the expertise sits in a lot of these teams, a lot of it is designed actually to look at things like risk and opportunity. It's not actually designed to deliver real economy impact. So I think in a way, and I think this is a small criticism to be clear, I think if you were to kind of reframe how you're talking about this a little bit, what I think would be more useful is to talk less in terms of sustainable investment is designed to achieve real economy impact and talk more about how investors can achieve real economy impact and the best ways to do that and evaluate it through that lens, which I think you do. But I struggle a bit with the assumption that a lot of these practices are designed to do that, because I'm just not sure that that's my experience. Okay, so secondly, and I think you've already had this criticism from a few practitioners, but I struggle with some of the conclusions you reached on engagement. I probably would say that this is a big part of my role and what I've done for years. So I think part of this reflects the fact that engagement, although it's probably the most well-studied sustainable investment strategy in the academic literature, it's still very poorly understood in terms of how it works and when it works and the conditions that need to arise for it to work. I think this is partly because it's very hard to study. It is a really difficult thing to measure and report on. So much of what happens in engagement happens under the surface. It's very private. It's very confidential.
Can I just dig into that a little bit more, actually, because I think, just to summarize how I would interpret our main findings on engagement, I mean, they were that actually probably it is the best evidenced channel in the literature for having an impact on what companies actually do. But there's a lot of evidence that engagement does cause companies to change their behavior. And I think I hope that our articles didn't kind of didn't give the impression that we don't think that's the case. I think what we were trying to point out was the limitations of that, because we couldn't see any evidence that engagement led companies to make very costly changes to what they do, and that therefore there's an inherent limitation to what engagement can achieve, and that therefore investors need to be thoughtful about what they're asking companies to do. And if you're asking a company to fundamentally kind of undermine its own business model, that's unlikely to be successful. But if you're asking them to do something better within the context of their business model that's not horrendously expensive for them to do, then they're more likely to do that. So are you saying that actually you think engagement is substantially more powerful than that, and we just underemphasize that? Or is there some other aspect of what we said that actually you didn't agree with?
So I would agree with you that I think if you're engaging with a company on a topic that's going to undermine its own business model, then that's probably unlikely to be successul and unlikely to happen. It also wouldn't be within the fiduciary duty of either the investor or the company to do that. So I think that, there's been a lot of talk about and I think you talked about this in the article, actually, like the idea that a lot of engagement outcomes are just low-hanging fruit. I think I struggle with that a little bit, in part because from my experience, just because something is low-hanging fruit doesn't necessarily mean the company is going to do it. So that's kind of the starting point. But I also think it depends on what you mean by low-hanging fruit. Like I think when you're engaging with a company, you might be asking for a measure that is not costly, relatively easy to do, but they're still unlikely to do it in the absence of pressure.
Yeah.
Because why would they? They've got so many other things to do.
Yeah.
And the second thing is, just because something is highly complex or costly to do doesn't necessarily mean it undermines the company's best interests or long-term strategy. The costly, difficult thing to do might be perfectly aligned with the long-term resilience and robustness of that company's strategy and the chance that it's going to be a really successful company and deliver strong investment returns. I guess the art of engagement is trying to figure out where those opportunities are. Sometimes the low-hanging fruit is a great thing to go for, because you look at something that a company could do that you think, okay, that is in their best interest. They're clearly not hearing it from enough people, and perhaps we can start having that conversation with them. And I can tell you from experience, I have had so many people, often years later, say to me, from within companies, say to me, you know, that thing that we did after you engaged with us on it, I had been asking the company to do that for 5 years, and we hadn't managed to get any progress. And as soon as a couple of investors asked us about it, we were able to start actually putting real work into making that happen. And I would put some of those outcomes into the low-hanging fruit stuff, like this, the things that I think are relatively low cost for the company to do. It just requires having stakeholders that are actually interested in it becoming something that is actually meaningful and material to stakeholders for them to do that. And the other thing is, I would say that, you know, I've seen some really big outcomes. And again, I can't talk about any of them because they're all confidential. And this is one of the challenges. But I've seen some really big outcomes achieved through engagement. And by that, I mean really long-term engagement with companies, with either an investor or a group of investors, that have resulted in particular commitments that I think are entirely aligned with the best long-term interest of both the company and the investor, but that would be considered to have very material outcomes on the global climate change space. You know, I'm thinking of very big emissions reduction targets, very big CapEx commitments. I have seen that myself. And do I think those things would have been achieved in the absence of engagement? Either the answer is no, I don't, or it is yes, maybe, but it would have taken a much longer period of time. Or maybe the outcome that would have been achieved would have been weaker than the outcome that was achieved because of engagement. I think the difference is, did the engagement help or cause that to happen? And I think in a lot of cases I've seen, I mean, again, it is hard to attribute engagement. This is a challenge, right? But I think in a lot of cases that I've seen, it is firmly my belief that some very big outcomes that came out of companies were as a result of engagement. And I just described that dynamic of engaging a really big, very material outcome. I don't think that that's happening every day, right? I think that is actually a rare occurrence, but you need to have a lot of conversations to get to the point where you can then be a part of a conversation that helps get a really strong outcome from engagement. I also think that, and one of the things that I think is really important about the academic literature on engagement actually, is there is a need to better understand the conditions that cause that kind of outcome to arise. Like, is it voting? Is it escalation? Is it private conversations? Is it collaborative? Like all of those different aspects that kind of go into what makes engagement effective. I think those are really valid questions as well. I'll go back to my disagree list. It's not so much disagree, but more I think could, you know, support what you're trying to do. There's some really interesting stuff out there, and I would say this is happening on the academic side, but also on the practitioner side, about fixed income and debt markets that I find very persuasive around refinancing decisions and conversations and where you can get outcomes from that. And I would say when we're thinking about how real economy impact happens, it's where you combine the engagement channel with the capital allocation channel. Like you're deciding to invest on the basis of an engagement that you've had. And I think that's where refinancing conversations can be super powerful. So I think that's something that I think it would be good to pick up.
On that kind of debt capital point and bank financing, I mean, and there's a sort of a number of kind of connected areas which I've reviewed in kind of other kind of more academic papers I've done. And I think they are interesting. And I think there is obviously a trigger point around availability of primary financing, in particular where you've got sticky banking relationships and all of this kind of stuff, where the financing decision can definitely have greater impact. I mean, I suppose when I looked at those papers really in detail, what I kind of concluded is that if you've got something where there's a certain economic momentum anyway, and so an example would be, you know, the use of thermal coal for power generation in certain developed markets, and it's already kind of under pressure, then these techniques can, you know, there definitely seems to be evidence that they can give these things a shove, right? And
Yeah.
towards the exit door a bit quicker. And that again for me would fall into the sort of the bucket of sort of valuable incremental activity. There's much less evidence that they can cause something that is fundamentally demanded, highly demanded, and profitable from happening. And I think that's one of the distinctions that we're sort of trying to draw here, in that, in terms of the perspective of investors, I guess, and this is what we were trying to say a little bit around realistic engagement. Although I take your point about the low hanging fruit emphasis, is that actually investors are well served if they can spot things where there are other forces that they can add to, as opposed to trying to push water uphill against sort of very, very powerful economic incentives. And I think some of the debt financing stuff kind of falls into that category as well.
Yeah, look, I think it really depends. I think if you a lot of the way I think you can achieve real impact here is when you have a lot of leverage and you have a particular position that you're taking. And so, to be clear, this isn't something that we would ever do. We don't offer debt finance. We're a pension fund. That's not the business we're in. But if you are a very, very large asset manager that does provide financing in that way, or if you're a bank, then, and you've been working with a company for years and years and years, and you're up to the point where you're talking about refinancing. I believe, both theoretically, but also I've heard from practitioners and peers, that you can have incredible leverage at that point, because one of my really good friends who is a practitioner in this space has this line. He says that the oxygen of a company is cash. At the end of the day, when you're in that moment, you're having that conversation with that company, they need cash, and you have a lot of leverage in terms of asking for what you want to ask for. I understand your point about, like, is it likely that investors would be pushing for projects that are highly, highly, profitable and make a whole lot of sense to do? Would they be pushing for those not to go ahead? I think that is tricky, but I also don't think that many projects that we would put into this actually exist. Like, most of the projects we'd be talking about in that category have substantial risks associated with them. They might be potentially profitable, but you'd also have to look at the long-term projections for some of those projects. And I actually think there would be good reasons to push back on them that would be both financial and in terms of the long-term kind of systemic climate risk. I think it's a very interesting question, though, partly because I think this could be a really powerful mechanism for impact from investors.
So, taking a step back now, so I take the point you made earlier, and say that this series of articles was focused on the motivation of sustainable investing having real world impact, and I completely accept there's a whole other motivation, which is around risk and return, and we explicitly didn't consider that in this series of articles. But if we stick with this sort of impact motivation, because a lot of asset owners are interested in sort of addressing systemic risks around issues such as climate change and biodiversity, how, based on your experience, where do you think investors should be spending their time? How do they most effectively address these systemic risks?
I'm a believer that public policy change is the fundamental shift that we need to get the outcomes we need on climate change and biodiversity. So I guess what I'm interested in is the extent to which investors can influence getting that enabling environment into place. And I think they can do that in quite a few ways. I really do. So I'd probably put it into kind of two main buckets, which is engagement and capital allocation. So I'd probably agree with some of your conclusions that I think, policy engagement is part of the engagement piece and corporate engagement is part of the engagement piece. And then on the capital allocation side, I probably tend to agree with the work that Ben Caldecott has done about looking at the difference between secondary and primary markets and looking at the ways that you can allocate capital to have more impact, particularly on the private market side. That's probably how I would think about that. And I think your point that you made about blended finance and working with DFIs, MDBs, looking at that kind of emerging markets, climate transition, climate adaptation piece is a big part of that too. What I think is important, though, for me, is what underpins all of this is signaling the market and norm shifting. I think if you're going to be going out and doing capital allocation, you've decided you're going to put an allocation into climate solutions, adaptation, whatever, a lot of what actually has the impact there is going to be the signaling of the market, and it's going to be actually establishing that as a norm. I think that is the case to an extent in the corporate engagement and the policy engagement side as well. And then the last thing I would say, just on the public policy engagement side, is so firstly, I completely agree with your premise that public policy is a hugely important part of this. But I'd also just say that I think that the work that investors can be focusing on a lot more is around the corporate lobbying piece, which again, I know that you've picked up on both in this piece, but also in a previous paper that you wrote. We've done a lot of work on this. I think that fundamentally, if you believe that what we need to get is that enabling public policy environment, then you have to be looking at this issue.
I'd like to come on to both of these dimensions on policy. Let's just start with where you finished there on the corporate lobbying. I mean, clearly it would kind of be helpful if the resistant lobbying machine around climate was operating less vigorously. How far do you think investors can go with that? And how do you balance what you do with companies versus what their directors may see as being in the interests of that company in order to try and, shape legislation to their interests? And also there's always this fine balance, isn't there, between, lobbying for effective regulation and lobbying for regulation that's skewed in your favor. How do you think about how far and how assertive you can be on that topic?
What I would say is a couple of things. The first thing is I would love to just see this coming up a lot more with investors who are talking to companies. Firstly, I would love to see this become much more common practice. Is part of things like the Climate Action 100 Plus, the NA 100 Plus benchmark. It's part of the Transition Pathway Initiative's assessment. So it is kind of popping up in different places, but I don't think this is necessarily the biggest issue on the radar of many investors, and I would love to see that change. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we have kind of started, so we did the standard on responsible climate lobbying. I think there's about 90 companies globally that have reported using that framework to date, which is, I think, a very good result. A lot of them are the biggest, some of the biggest emitters in the world. And I think, I'm very skeptical about disclosure. I don't think disclosure is really the most helpful. I think it's a helpful start, but I don't think it actually often leads to the action that you want to see. But I think that when you're talking about a topic that has so often been done in kind of dark hallways behind, very hidden, it is really important to start shining a light on it. So I think both having governance around this and also transparency is really important. So to rest on the governance part of what we would like to see is just for it to be clear which board member is responsible. I'll give you an example. In the autos industry, there's a lot of lobbying that happens against internal combustion engine phase out dates, or against things like vehicle emission standards. That's been happening for a really long time. I'd like to see when companies put out their net zero plan, for them to actually say, what are the policy dependencies that we need to get this done? And that would include EV charging infrastructure. It would include supply chains. It would include probably taxonomies. It would include a whole range of different things. And what we'd like to see companies do is actually actively start lobbying for those sorts of things, as opposed to, some of the delay kind of tactics that we have seen from some industry associations in the past. But getting companies from the point of disclosure to that point of action is a real challenge. And so when I say that I think more investors should be interested and we think disclosure is important, that's all true. But getting companies from the point of engagement on this, disclosure on this, to then taking action and changing their positions is not an easy thing. And I don't think we've cracked it yet. But I think it's worth the effort. I really do. I think if you combine corporate engagement with companies on this topic, with investors also directly engaging and via their industry associations, engaging with public policy makers on these topics, that is a powerful combination.
I'd like to come on to the other dimension of policy now, which is the investor channel of policy influence with governments. And this is also coming much more into focus, I think, as a priority for investors, although sometimes it strikes me that it's a little bit kind of generic and high level. What's your experience of what makes for effective influence of government policy and how investors can best approach that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think having a really clear understanding about what the economic levers are that will actually drive the transition that we need to see is probably the most fundamental part. And what I think investors should be really focusing on in their conversations, because if you think about what investors are some of the most credible economic actors in society. They have a genuine, real stake in economic stability, in the flourishing of investment markets and capital markets. And they're often invested in everything. There's a lot of a lot of investors, particularly like us, the asset owners, have really strong exposure across the economy. So I think what they have a really important role to do is be really credible economic actors in talking about economic policy and policies that will help kind of drive the transition and create economic stability. So I think that's what they should be focused on. I also think there's a role for investors to be really specific about what I mean here. I think that there's a real role for investors to point out that at the moment, we are actually exacerbating an existing market failure, climate change, by offering subsidies in many jurisdictions to projects that make the problem worse. And we should be redeploying those subsidies to things that are going to make the transition easier. I think in terms of delivering outcomes, there's probably two other things that I would say. One is collaborative policy engagement is really, really helpful, particularly through kind of the industry associations. I'm on the board of IIGCC. They do some great work there. In the UK SIF do great work. So there's plenty of opportunities to do that. But then the last thing that I would say, and this links back to kind of our original conversation around why are investors pursuing strategies that maybe don't deliver real economy impact? If you are sitting down with a policymaker and you don't have any skin in the game, you haven't been walking the walk, you haven't been talking, you haven't actually been doing much of this investment, you haven't been engaging with portfolio companies, you're not going to have the same credibility as someone who has. And so while you might say, oh, well, who cares if you've, overweighted climate solutions in your equity portfolio, or if you've, invested in a particular strategy that maybe doesn't have real economy impact, or if you're having these conversations with portfolio companies and maybe the impact isn't hugely material, I would argue that, yes, even if that's the case and those particular actions aren't having that impact, your ability to sit down with a policymaker and talk from experience about the barriers and opportunities that you've experienced as an investor in trying to deploy capital in emerging markets for adaptation, or your experience talking to your portfolio companies about the problems and challenges that they're having decarbonizing, particularly when you hit those barriers, which you do in engagement sometimes, where you go, you know what, I think this company's done about as much as it can do without policy changing. When you can then take that and sit down in a meeting with a policymaker and say, actually, what needs to happen is this, and I know this because I've spoken to 15 companies about this issue and they're all telling me it's an issue and we want to see that happen. I think even though the original action maybe didn't have the real economy impact, the act of then using that to put into policy means that you can have that real economy impact. And so it means that all of these actions actually can line up to doing something really high impact.
That's very interesting description of how that could all come together. Given my final question, given everything that's going on at the moment with the Net Zero Asset Management Alliance, GFANZ, Climate Action 100 Plus, it would be remiss not to touch on this topic. And I know that senior leaders at the Church of England Pensions Board have been pretty vocal about the need, very vocal about the need to keep a focus on climate change in particular as an issue. What do you want asset managers to do now, and how should these alliances proceed?
Yeah, it's a good question. So firstly, I think the ship has sailed on putting climate change away as an issue. It's not going to stop being an issue on any asset manager's agenda. It's a financial risk issue. It's just part of smart investing. So it's just not going to go away. However, I think, integrating climate as a risk and opportunity is quite different to what we've mostly been talking about today, which is around this kind of systemic change issue. Yeah. And so I think what asset managers will be questioning right now is what should we be focusing on? How public can we be about that? Which initiatives should we be signing up to? And fundamentally, what do our clients want? So what I think we will be talking to our asset managers about is what's possible within the context they're operating in, what they can continue to do and to report on and to provide detail on. What I'd like to see from them is more detail in terms of how they're looking at things like deploying these strategies for climate solutions, adaptation investing, how they're looking at innovation in those areas across all asset classes and also across more jurisdictions, because obviously we know that the emerging markets climate finance gap is huge. So I'll be talking to them about that and obviously continuing to talk to them about things like stewardship. The other thing is we would like to see more from asset managers in terms of their disclosure on corporate climate lobbying, unsurprisingly. Right. It'd be really good to better understand how they're governing that and managing that internally. But lastly, I think that this shift and whatever happens to kind of some of these asset manager initiatives, it will put more emphasis on asset owners and our role. Like fundamentally, I think that's the takeout from this. Asset owners are going to need to be more clear about our objectives, both publicly through how we put out plans and targets and commitments and what we sign up to, but also we're going to have to be very clear through our mandates and our engagement with managers so that we can be really clear about the kinds of strategies that we want. And if we do want real economy impact, we should be really clear about that and stipulate what we want, but also ask the managers to define for us a really credible theory of change for how they're going to achieve that. And I think, you know, from talking to other practitioners, I think a lot of the other asset owners I speak to are very savvy about this. They know the difference between, you know, signing up to something that is an equity strategy versus a private market strategy. They know the difference between looking at strategies that use divestment a lot versus looking at something that might be working more at the margins or a blended finance vehicle. Like they know the difference between those things. So I think it's going to be about being very clear about what we want from those asset managers and in particular investment strategies.
Laura, that's been really interesting discussion. Thanks so much for taking the time.
No worries. Thanks for having me, and keep researching all of these questions.
Will do.